The image of a human body plunged into a cauldron of scalding liquid may sound like something torn from legend or horror fiction, but boiling alive was a very real form of capital punishment. In parts of medieval and early modern Europe, it is remembered today less for its frequency than for its shocking cruelty. A punishment that brought together the medieval fascination with spectacle and the authorities' desire to create a penalty so terrifying that it would deter even the most secretive crimes. In its simplest form, boiling alive was exactly as the word suggests. The condemned was placed into a large cauldron, vat, or pot filled with water, oil, tar, or even molten lead, and subjected to heat until death. Sources describe both immersion into liquid already boiling and placement into a vessel while cold, with a fire lit beneath so that the person was slowly cooked alive as the liquid reached scalding temperatures. Either way, the result was agony prolonged in a way that surpassed many other medieval methods of execution. The crimes that merited such a punishment were often those perceived as particularly treacherous or insidious. Poisoning is one of the most consistent associations. In an age where food and drink could be tampered with and where the crime struck at the very heart of trust between ruler and subject, family and household, poisoners were considered enemies of the social fabric itself. Unlike a murderer who struck openly with a weapon, the poisoner worked in secrecy, striking with deception and cowardice. For that reason, lawmakers often sought a penalty that carried the same qualities of horror and secrecy, but amplified for public effect. To be boiled was not just to be killed, it was to be unmasked and made a spectacle. In England, the practice gained a notorious foothold in the reign of Henry VIII. Following a rash of poisonings, a statute of 1531 declared that those guilty of poisoning would suffer death by boiling. Chroniclers describe several instances where men and women accused of such crimes were led to great vats in public squares and lowered into the cauldron before gathered crowds. These executions were not brief. Some reports insist the victims were repeatedly lifted from the pot and plunged back in, prolonging the agony. Others know that the condemned could scream for minutes as skin blistered, flesh tore, and the crowd looked on. For Henry's government, such a punishment was not merely retribution. It was an announcement of power and a warning that treachery would be met with merciless reprisal. Yet England was not unique. Boiling appears in continental sources as well, though with variations. In parts of the Holy Roman Empire, statutes against coin counterfeiting sometimes prescribed boiling as the penalty. The reasoning lay in symbolism. Counterfeiters were seen as corruptors of currency, melting and reshaping metal for deceitful ends, to punish them by melting their bodies into a cauldron of oil or lead carried both poetic justice and chilling intimidation. Chroniclers from the Low Countries and German states occasionally reference such punishments. Though they were never common, the very rarity of boiling made it stand out more vividly. Ordinary criminals faced hanging, beheading, or burning, all familiar to medieval crowds. But boiling, when announced, was shocking enough to draw enormous audiences. The crowd was not simply witnessing a body destroyed. They were witnessing the slow destruction of flesh in a way that resembled cooking. The kitchen-like imagery blurred the line between punishment and grotesque parody of domestic life. A cauldron, an everyday household object, became a tool of state terror. This familiarity twisted into horror ensured that such events would remain in memory long after the actual execution. Medieval chroniclers do not disguise their fascination with such spectacles. Reports linger on the suffering, the sounds, the smells. The odor of cooking flesh, described with nauseating detail, was part of the punishment's impact on the spectators. It was designed not only to break the body of the condemned, but to brand the memory of the crime and punishment into every witness's mind. In a world where public execution was theater as much as justice, boiling alive occupied one of the darkest corners of the stage. Still, not all voices approved. Even in its own time, boiling could provoke unease. Some churchmen, jurists, and observers found the penalty excessive. questioning whether it truly aligned with Christian justice or whether it represented cruelty for cruelty's sake. These doubts mattered because punishment in the medieval and early modern world was not only about vengeance, it was about legitimacy. The ruler's justice needed to be seen as righteous, not sadistic. When boiling threatened to tip the balance, reformers began to push against its use. Nonetheless, the idea endured well into the 16th and 17th centuries in some places. Continental Europe saw sporadic cases, though often linked to extraordinary circumstances. Poison plots, conspiracies, or treasonous actions. In these moments, when ordinary penalties were deemed insufficient, boiling reemerged as the most shocking tool in the arsenal of justice, and always, its use was as much symbolic as practical. The condemned was not simply executed, but transformed into an example so terrifying that no one would dare repeat the crime. The paradox of boiling as execution lies in its effectiveness as deterrence. While undeniably brutal, its very excess limited its frequency. Rulers knew that too much cruelty could provoke sympathy for the condemned or disgust at the authorities. Thus, boiling alive was reserved for rare, high-profile cases. It was spectacle at its most extreme, used sparingly to maximize impact. When it did occur, the punishment carried with it an almost ritualistic weight, embedding itself in local memory for decades. The punishment also raises questions about the medieval relationship with the human body. To immerse flesh into boiling liquid was to treat the condemned as less than human, as matter to be destroyed rather than as a soul awaiting divine judgment. Other punishments often allow for some measure of dignity: the swift stroke of the axe, the rope of the gallows, even the flames of the stake framed as purifying fire. Boiling stripped away dignity entirely, reducing the human body to something indistinguishable from meat in a pot. In doing so, it exposed the darker undercurrent of medieval justice. When the crime was considered monstrous, the punishment became monstrous too. The record of boiling alive as a method of execution is not vast, but its significance lies in the intensity of its memory and the terror it inspired. Unlike other punishments, it carried a visceral quality that was impossible to forget. To see or hear of it was to be reminded of how fragile human flesh was, how vulnerable the body could be when subjected to the extremes of human cruelty. It encapsulated the fear-driven world of medieval justice, where the need to deter crime justified punishments designed to horrify as much as to kill. The chilling legacy of boiling alive did not end with its medieval usage. By the late 16th and early 17th centuries, the punishment still lingered in European legal codes, though increasingly as a relic rather than a common penalty. In England, the statute of Henry VIII that legalized boiling for poisoners remained technically on the books, until it was repealed under the reign of Edward VI. This repeal reflected a shift in sensibilities. While harsh punishments persisted, the extremity of boiling seemed increasingly out of step with evolving ideas of law, mercy, and governance. Yet the echoes of the punishment persisted across Europe. In the Low Countries, several chroniclers reported isolated cases where men accused of poisoning wells during outbreaks of plague were executed by boiling. The association between poison, disease, and hidden treachery was so terrifying that authorities turned to the most spectacular methods to reassure their populations. To boil a supposed poisoner alive was not only to punish the individual, but to signal that invisible threats, the unseen killers, would be met with visible and unforgettable retribution. In Germany and parts of Central Europe, records hinted occasional use of boiling in the punishment of counterfeiters. Because money was the lifeblood of commerce and order, tampering with currency was considered a crime not just against the state, but against the moral fabric of society. To execute counterfeiters in vats of molten lead or oil symbolically mirrored the destruction of the false coins they had produced. Again, the punishment's logic lay not only in physical suffering but in the theatrical alignment between crime and penalty. But as Europe moved into the early modern period, debates around justice became louder. Humanist writers, jurists, And even clergymen began to argue that punishments should be proportionate, that they should uphold a sense of dignity even in death, while few doubted the need for executions. Methods like boiling alive struck many as unnecessarily sadistic. These critiques chipped away at the legitimacy of the penalty until, by the 18th century, it was virtually unthinkable in most of Europe. Still, the memory of boiling did not vanish. It survived in chronicles, in grisly pamphlets, and in the collective imagination of ordinary people. Tales of criminals shrieking in vats, of flesh blistering and bursting, of the unbearable stench rising above the crowd, were retold as warnings. Parents might use the stories to frighten children away from mischief. Preachers invoked them as symbols of hellfire and divine judgment. Boiling had become less a legal reality and more a cultural memory, a reminder of humanity's capacity for cruelty in the name of justice. From a modern perspective, boiling alive is often placed alongside other infamous punishments such as impalement, scaphism, or the breaking wheel. Punishments so brutal that they shock even centuries later. But it is worth pausing to consider why such practices emerged in the first place. They were not acts of random cruelty, but responses to specific anxieties, poison, treachery, conspiracy. In societies where trust was fragile and threats were often invisible, punishments had to do more than kill. They had to dramatize, to terrify, to create a sense that the law could unmask and destroy even the most hidden enemies. The punishment also speaks to the theatricality of justice in medieval and early modern Europe. Execution was never a private affair. It was public theater, meant to educate, frighten, and entertain. In that sense, boiling alive was perhaps the ultimate spectacle, a punishment so shocking that it etched itself into memory with fire and steam. It reveals how societies use the human body as a stage, turning flesh into a canvas upon which the state's authority was written in blood and agony. By the Enlightenment, the tide had turned decisively against such punishments. Philosophers like Cesare Beccaria, in his famous On Crimes and Punishments 1764, condemned executions that relied on cruelty rather than swiftness. His influence, combined with broader reforms, helped push Europe toward punishments that, while still harsh, aimed to preserve some measure of human dignity. The guillotine, for example, was invented with the intention of ending life quickly and uniformly, in stark contrast to the lingering torment of boiling. Today, the idea of boiling alive seems almost medieval in the worst sense of the word, barbaric, grotesque, unimaginable. Yet its existence reminds us of the fragility of the human body and the terrifying extremes that states have gone to in their quest for order and control. It is a window into a world where justice and cruelty walked hand in hand, where the cauldron in the marketplace could become an instrument of law. And perhaps that is why stories of boiling alive continue to fascinate. They force us to confront the uncomfortable truth that beneath civilization's veneer, fear has always been a powerful tool of governance. Whether through laws, punishments, or public spectacle, rulers of the past wielded terror as much as they wielded swords. Boiling alive, with its horrifying blend of symbolism and suffering, was one of the sharpest weapons in that arsenal. The story of this punishment closes not with its disappearance, but with its enduring place in cultural memory. It survives in history books, in dark folklore, and in the whispered acknowledgement of how cruel human beings can be to one another. By remembering it, we are reminded not only of the brutality of the past, but of the ongoing responsibility to ensure justice is never twisted into cruelty again. If you found this exploration of one of history's most horrifying punishments compelling, make sure to subscribe, share, and join the conversation. What other forgotten or shocking punishments from history would you like to see uncovered? Dive with us into the darkest corners of the past, and let us continue revealing how humanity's history of cruelty shaped the world we live in today.